Kwekwe Unusakut, Tanse, hello, bonjour. Je suis ici aujourd'hui avec ma sous-ministre Christiane Fox. I first want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today in Ottawa from the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Thank you for joining us. I want to congratulate, in particular, Chief Skeed and all members of the Anishinaabe Wajish-Onagum Nation. Each and every long-term water advisory lift is significant, and I'm grateful to have been able to celebrate this morning the most recent one, about an hour ago. Thanks to the leadership and determination of Chief Skeed and the project team on the ground, as of today, residents of Wajish-Onagum Nation now have access to clean drinking water, as they lifted the community's last remaining drinking water advisory. This marks an important milestone, the lifting of the 100th long-term drinking water advisory in a First Nation since November of 2015. I also want to congratulate Hanikotiin First Nation government in BC on lifting the last remaining long-term drinking water advisory in their community, bringing reliable access to clean water to 8 homes. This marks the 101st long-term drinking water advisory lifted since November 2015, and it was a real pleasure to speak to Chief Lulua yesterday and his team on the significance of that lifting and their priorities going forward. There's more progress today than ever before. In November 2015, when we formed government, there were 105 long-term drinking water advisories on public systems on reserves across the country. There was no tracking of how many advisories existed or plans for each one to resolve it. The funding was short-term and didn't allow for long-term planning. Most importantly, there was no commitment to fix the issue. Officially, as of today, First Nations with support from our government have lifted 101 long-term water advisories since then. Notably, all long-term drinking water advisories were lifted in the Atlantic, Alberta, and Quebec. During the same time, of importance, 175 short-term advisories have also been lifted. Major milestones like these are only possible because of the result of countless smaller actions that have been undertaken day after day, community by community. They are the result of tireless work by water operators and by project teams in communities, by the dedication of chiefs and council, and by officials at Indigenous Services Canada who have pursued this goal relentlessly. The cumulative effect of these actions in First Nations communities across the country is that today substantial progress has been achieved. Today, 98 new water plants and 418 upgrades have been funded, which translates to over 460,000 people, 5,800 homes, and 430 community buildings, including schools and health centers that will all have clean drinking water, which simply hasn't been the case 5 years ago. This reflects more than $3.5 billion in investments over the last 5 years. Je tiens à féliciter tous les membres d'Anishinaabe de la Nation Wajish-Onagum, de la Première Nation et la Première Nation de Hanikotiin en Colombie-Britannique. Hier, les deux communautés ont levé leurs derniers avis sur la qualité de l'eau potable dans leur communauté, représentant respectivement les 100 et 101e avis à long terme levés depuis 2015. Les avis à long terme concernant la qualité d'eau potable sont plus complexes que chacun d'entre nous ne le souhaite. C'est ce que j'ai entendu directement des membres de la communauté et ce que j'ai pu observer en partie pendant mon mandat de ministre. Néanmoins, nous restons plus déterminés que jamais à faire en sorte que chaque communauté des Premières Nations ait accès à de l'eau potable. Notre engagement à lever tous les avis à long terme concernant l'eau potable sur les réseaux publics dans les réserves demeure ferme. Nous continuerons de travailler en partenariat avec les Premières Nations pour veiller à ce que chacun d'entre eux soit levé et que cet engagement demeure. Depuis 2016, notre gouvernement a investi plus de 3,5 milliards de dollars pour améliorer l'accès à l'eau potable et la gestion des eaux usées. Ce sont des investissements historiques. Grâce à ces investissements, les communautés ont fait de progrès significatifs. Oui, il y a encore du travail devant nous, mais nous avons un plan. Pour chacun des 58 avis à long terme en place dans 38 communautés, des travaux sont en cours pour répondre à chacun d'entre eux de manière durable et ce, conformément aux priorités des communautés. I now direct you to the slides that are popping up of all long-term drinking water advisories that have been in place since 2015, 63.5% have been lifted. An additional 20% have projects that will help lift drinking water advisories under construction, and 10.7% have lifts recommendations in place, which means that projects are complete and that communities are in the very last stages before actually lifting the water advisory, which is their decision. To keep track of our progress in a truly open and transparent way, we've just launched a new webpage that will be the hub for community-focused water information. The new homepage is visible on the screen next to me. The new website demonstrates the progress communities have made since 2015. The investments provided outline the work that still needs to be done to achieve clean drinking water. It breaks down all remaining work, community by community, and will be continuously updated to reflect the most current information. I believe Canadians need to see what I'm seeing. The information here goes beyond long-term tracking drinking water advisory. It also includes details on why communities face long-term drinking water advisories, the process involved in lifting an advisory, the status of each project, and the work required to keep water systems running and staffed. It is a one-stop shop for all information on our progress in achieving our commitment to lift all long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations on reserve. Each of the 38 remaining communities with a long-term water advisory will have a page as shown on the screen right now. On this page, anyone will be able to see the projected lift date, a tracker on the status of the projects, and a history on the work undertaken to date. I will also be following up personally with communities to give them written confirmation of the progress to date and our commitment to them in lifting the long-term water advisory. There will also be a regularly updated map to be able to see at a glance where the remaining long-term water advisories are located. Lastly, I want to bring your attention to this page, highlighting the steps to lifting long-term drinking water advisories. The process to lift a water advisory is not always simple, straightforward process. It can be complex, requiring multiple steps at multiple stages. While each water advisory is unique, this page provides a comprehensive overview of the work being done by First Nations, Indigenous Services Canada, and partners to provide clean drinking water to communities. Nous sommes reconnaissants d'avoir eu l'occasion de travailler avec une entreprise autochtone pour développer cette page web et nous la mettrons au jour en permanence avec les dernières informations au fur et à mesure que nous avancerons. La dernière année a certes présenté de nouveaux défis, des défis que beaucoup d'entre nous ne s'attendaient pas à relever. Tout au long de la pandémie de la COVID-19, la santé et le bien-être des membres des communautés des Premières Nations ont été notre priorité et la priorité absolue du Canada. Les Premières Nations ont été exceptionnelles pour protéger leur communauté contre le virus et continuent dans cet effort. Cette pandémie a affecté presque tous les aspects de notre vie quotidienne et c'est aussi le cas en ce qui concerne les travaux d'infrastructure. Alors que certaines communautés ont pu poursuivre leur travail avec une interruption minimale, d'autres ont dû cesser complètement les travaux en cours. Nous travaillons en véritable partenariat avec les communautés, ce qui signifie respecter leurs priorités. Tout en poursuivant nos efforts collectifs pour lutter contre la pandémie, ensemble, le gouvernement du Canada et les Premières Nations continuent de travailler sans relâche sur l'élaboration des solutions à long terme et non seulement soutenir un accès durable à de l'eau potable, mais aussi pour rétablir la confiance des Premières Nations dans ces sources d'eau. We're in it for the long term. The work doesn't stop once advisories are lifted. We're also making investments in expanding water infrastructure and operations, in maintenance and training programs to ensure we never find ourselves in this situation again. To that end, the fall economic statement committed $1.5 billion in new funding to accelerate the work on our commitment to clean drinking water in First Nations communities and $114 million per year ongoing to increase support for daily operations and maintenance of water and wastewater infrastructure on reserves. We've heard from First Nations leadership that operations and maintenance is essential to efficiently managing their water infrastructure, the critical asset in a community. To support communities in doing so, we'll be providing $616 million over 6 years and $114 million per year ongoing thereafter for operations and maintenance costs, ensuring longer life cycles and more durable systems, enabling First Nations to better maintain their water and wastewater infrastructure over the long term. Ongoing operations and maintenance support is critical to ensuring the longevity of this commitment, and we know that unexpected events happen, but we also know that we can plan to minimize the risks to water systems to support the upkeep and the maintenance of infrastructure that's been overlooked for far too long, all with the goal of supporting access to reliable, clean, safe drinking water in all First Nations communities. The department's also supporting a First Nations-led engagement process for the review of safe drinking water legislation. This work will enable a co-developed legislative framework to address the concerns of the existing Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act and would enable the development of a regulatory regime that supports First Nations to ensure safe drinking water access on reserve. We're also continuing work with First Nations to co-develop a long-term water and wastewater strategy to ensure ongoing sustainability of water and wastewater on reserves. Our government's making progress to fix these historical wrongs, and Canadians know just how important this is. We remain committed and continue to stand with First Nations partners to lift all long-term drinking boil water advisories and ensure access to clean and safe drinking water for generations to come. J'aimerais maintenant aussi prendre l'occasion pour vous fournir une mise à jour du COVID-19. Au cours des dernières semaines, le Canada a autorisé 2 nouveaux vaccins de COVID-19, dont le vaccin AstraZeneca et le vaccin Johnson & Johnson. Cela signifie que le Canada dispose désormais de 4 vaccins sûrs et efficaces approuvés par des experts de la santé au Canada. Il nous aidera à vacciner plus de personnes plus rapidement. However, it is concerning that vaccine misinformation has been circulating to some communities. I urge everyone to please be careful. Look for and share information only from trusted sources. This includes provincial and territorial health authorities, community health centers, nursing stations, and local healthcare providers. We're diligently working to identify and address all unsolicited and suspicious offers of COVID-19 vaccines for sale that have been made available to any First Nation, Inuit, and Métis community. Canada has procured safe, effective, and free vaccines for everyone and will continue to ensure the authenticity and safety of any and all vaccines being provided. We'll also keep and continue to keep an eye on the variants of concern. Thankfully, only 2 cases of the B117 variant of concern have been found on reserve thus far, but we have reason to believe that there may be more that have yet to be confirmed. In Ontario, we're keeping a close eye on Thunder Bay as they moved into lockdown last week. Following outbreaks at correctional facilities and schools and among the homeless population, my department's currently working with the City of Thunder Bay, the Thunder Bay Urban Indigenous Task Force in the province of Ontario to address the immediate needs of Indigenous peoples living in the area. We're also closely monitoring the COVID-19 outbreak in Arvie at Nunavut, which has seen a surge of cases in the past few weeks. A public health rapid response team remains in the community and more than 2,300 COVID-19 tests have been performed to date. Nous continuons de travailler en collaboration avec les forces armées canadiennes dans les communautés, les provinces et les territoires dans le but de soutenir la campagne de vaccination. Présentement, les forces armées canadiennes sont sur le terrain dans plusieurs communautés des Premières Nations, y compris la Première Nation de Fort Nelson en Colombie-Britannique, Première Nation de Musquet Dam Lake en Ontario pour aider à gérer les éclosions de COVID-19 et distribuer les vaccins. Plus tard cette semaine, les forces armées seront aussi déployées dans la Nation Cree de Mathias-Colombe en Manitoba pour soutenir la communauté qui fait présentement face à une éclosion alarmante de la COVID-19 avec plus de 100 cas actifs. En date du 8 mars, les communautés des Premières Nations dans les réserves avaient connaissance de 1223 cas actifs, ce qui nous amène à un total de 23 368 cas positifs de COVID-19 confirmés. Il y a donc 20 897 cas rétablis et tragiquement 248 décès, mais le nombre de cas actifs représente un seuil qui n'a pas été vu depuis novembre. Nous continuons à travailler avec les Premières Nations et nos partenaires provinciaux et territoriaux pour mettre en place des vaccins. Au total, en date du 4 mars, 480 communautés ont commencé à se faire vacciner. Le nombre de doses administrées s'élève à plus de 127 000, soit plus de 43 % de la population autochtone adulte. Notre objectif reste de nous assurer que les vaccins de COVID-19 sont disponibles pour tous ceux qui en ont besoin. En obtenant un vaccin, en pratiquant la distanciation physique, en portant un masque et en nous lavant les mains, nous pouvons continuer à prévenir la propagation du COVID-19. Ensemble, nous protégerons nos communautés et retournerons à la vie normale plus rapidement. Miigwech, unanimique. Merci. Thank you et merci. Nous sommes impatients maintenant de prendre vos questions.
Nous allons maintenant répondre aux questions, une question de suivi, une question et une question de suivi. Et on va commencer avec des questions par téléphone. Operator, first question, please.
Thank you. Merci. For questions, please press star 1 on your device's keypad. Pour toute question, faites étoile 1 sur votre appareil. The first question is from Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Your line is open.
Good morning, Minister. The chief of Puckatawagan said that the moment the vaccines entered her community, people let their guard down and started holding parties. I'm wondering what kind of messaging Indigenous Services Canada is issuing to bands about following protocols, or if that responsibility is more under the provincial or the band realm.
No, and thank you, Dylan. And what may seem as a very natural human reaction is something that we're all fighting, I think, as Canadians. Our efforts have been to underscore, and whether it's in conjunction with the province or the local health authorities, which are the most trusted source, the federal government's been engaged in ensuring that people know that, yeah, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but there's a whole heck of a lot of tunnel left. And until everyone's vaccinated, none of us are particularly that safe. And so, not knowing, and again, the science is evolving with respect to the vaccine. We know that what it does and what's proven to do is prevent mortality, prevent severe onset of COVID-19 onto people. We don't know for sure whether that prevents spread. And so that's the big question mark. And we hope that the data will prove otherwise. But as part of that analysis, we have to make sure that the very basic things that have kept people safe, and that's something we do in conjunction with provincial health authorities and most importantly, local health leadership, is to reinforce those public safety health measures. You just need to look around the world to see that those countries that in some cases have a larger penetration of the vaccine distribution, we're also dealing at the same time with massive outbreaks. And so while vaccines provide that light at the end of the tunnel, there's still a whole heck of a lot of work to go, and that is a community by community approach. And we do our absolute best, and to the extent you can get that out through your mediums, Dylan, we'd really encourage that as well, because it's a multi-pronged approach. My worry as a minister, and that's worry of every health official, is about getting that last vaccine into the arms of people and not the first.
Thank you. And I'm wondering about the cost and the rationale for updating the website on boil water advisories. And I mean this with the greatest respect, but I can anticipate a lot of these communities would say they want more work done on fixing the issue instead of better graphics or more photos. There is an existing dashboard, so I'm just wondering if the First Nations themselves have asked for this redesign and how much money this is costing.
Well, I think Canadians, I think in particular First Nations that are under long-term water advisories, want to get as much information about what the plan is, and what's going on in their fellow communities. Today was a great moment to lift up, and I had a ceremony with Chief Skeed in Washajonagum, and if I could share that with you, it would be great. The very positive, happy to finally see, after 9 years, which is an unacceptable time period, fresh water flowing through taps in their community, and it represents an incredible amount of work done in particular by those community members. Same thing for Honeycoutine yesterday, just the work that they're doing to make sure that their community members have clean water is great, and we want to continue that momentum. But they've also showed concern for other communities across Canada that have not lifted their long-term water advisories. So they too want to see what's going on in other communities. So the effort today is for Canadians to see what I see, and to give everyone as much information as possible as to the status of each community, as well as the work that's been done and the commitment of this government to get it done. We walked into 105 as a government, 105 long-term water advisories with absolutely zero plan to get them lifted. Today we've lifted 101, and there's a plan for every other community. And I think that needs to be shared with Canadians. It needs to be shared with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. And you can draw your own conclusion as to the quantity and quality of that website, Dylan. And we obviously welcome your feedback, but it is an effort to get out there as much information as we have so people can see the progress that's been made.
Thanks, Dylan. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from Jamie Pashagumscum, APTN News. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, and first of all, congratulations to the new addition to your family. My question is just for clarity, actually. What is, besides the website, exactly what is new today? Like you mentioned 616 for O&M. What else is besides the website? What's new here? What you're announcing?
Yeah, and thanks for the congratulations, Jamie. I'm a bit young to be a grandfather, so I'm getting a little tired of the pipe and slipper comments that have been made to me by some very close friends. I'll be 48 on Friday, but it's a great day. It's a great day to have a new life in this world. So thank you. What's new today? When I spoke to you and your colleagues in late November, early December, you asked me when are we going to get more information about communities that are still on long-term water advisories. Olivia, who's ready to ask a question, had contacted communities independently to get their views on things and produced an article about that. But I think it's important for Canadians to have all the information that we're seeing as much as in real time as we can share, obviously respecting community needs as well and their wishes. We have a plan to get those remaining water advisories lifted, and you need to see them. This is a promise that I made during that press conference in December when you said when will they all be lifted? Well, now people can look onto the website and see the detailed planning involved. And I don't underestimate the amount of work to be done, particularly in the face of a global pandemic. But we're ready to work through this. The funds that we announced in December as part of the fall economic statement were ones that were designed to ensure the capital investments through a very challenging time of COVID, which we can't underestimate the impact of, and we can't underestimate what it may still do. I say, and because I know it to be true, that we've lost in effect a construction season, but it isn't an excuse. The Prime Minister put me here to get it done, and that's what I plan to do. People can see that. They don't need to trust my words. They can see that on the website and see the commitment of the government to lift all of those water advisories. So this is an effort in transparency. Each community, most importantly, I will be contacting and have started to contact directly to give them further undertakings that we will be with them for the long run. Recall, as we spoke in December, that there was much concern about where the Government of Canada would be past the March 2021 deadline. And that's where the discussion about the massive investments in operation maintenance with respect to a formula that was outdated comes into play, because the money that was announced in November gives the financial backing of the Government of Canada to communities who perhaps were wondering where we were going to go in March of 2021. And our comment to them and our commitment to them is we will be there in the long run. So sum up, and to answer your question as to what is new, yes, you have a new website with more details that we needed to update after having assessed the impact of COVID on those communities, and communities, most importantly, two of which we're celebrating the lift, and that's what I would say is new, because we're celebrating those lifts, and it's very important to highlight both Honeycoteen and Washoshonogum, because 100 is a milestone. They now have clean water, and so those are the new elements that we're highlighting today.
Jamie, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. Yes, you mentioned. I know everybody's very pleased to hear your commitment to transparency. But concerning the March 2021 deadline, do we have a new deadline? Can you commit to a new deadline?
Again, Jamie, everyone will be able to see what's on that website. Some communities and I've mentioned them before, in particular, Shoal Lake 40, Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, have longer term projects. And they have chosen, and this is a choice that I respect, to maintain their long-term water advisories until such time as those long-term projects are completed. And we said we're going to be with them. So you'll be able to see that on the website. I think what Canadians are interested is in, there is a balance of them that we are hopeful about. Number of them are producing clean water, and they are in the process of assessing when to lift that long-term water advisory. An easy example of that is Wabsimong, who is ready to lift. However, as you may well note, they've gone through a pretty devastating surge of COVID in their community. So you can imagine the challenge of doing the final tests on the water system and then lifting. That is one of many examples where there is a little bit of complexity that we have to navigate. But I'm hopeful with respect to the short term. And what I think Canadians should be hopeful about is there actually is a plan in the case of communities that still have those long-term water advisories in place.
Thank you, Jamie. And we'll take one more question from the phone before turning to the room. Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Julie Marceau, Radio-Canada. À vous.
Oui, bonjour, M. Miller. Félicitations comme grand-papa. Vous êtes un jeune grand-père. Moi, je serai une vieille mère dans 2 mois. Je voulais juste savoir, pour le site Web, j'ai un peu la même question. Est-ce que c'est cosmétique ou il y a vraiment comme des données qui n'étaient pas là, puis là, qui vont être affichées clairement? Puis aussi dans la mesure où il y a plein de communautés autochtones qui n'ont juste pas accès à Internet. Donc, tu sais, c'est pour qui exactement? Puis pourquoi on annonce ça aujourd'hui?
D'abord, merci Julie. Comme je l'ai dit à Jamie, j'ai encore 47 ans pour 2 jours. Donc oui, encore très jeune pour être grand-père, mais merci. Les cosmétiques, non. Écoutez, on veut que ça soit beau, évidemment, mais ce n'est pas la raison pour laquelle on a demandé la rétraction d'une boîte autochtone pour donner des avis sur comment présenter non seulement les données qui existent sur les avis d'ébullition à long terme qui interpellent tous les Canadiens, évidemment les communautés concernées par des avis d'ébullition à long terme, mais il va y avoir, et vous le constaterez vous-même, qu'il va y avoir plus d'informations sur, de un, le plan communauté par communauté en ce qui a trait au processus de levée de leur propre avis d'ébullition d'eau à long terme, ainsi que l'engagement du gouvernement du Canada à travailler à long terme avec ces communautés. Donc, plus d'informations. L'effort que j'essaie, c'était mon engagement quand nous étions parlé à la fin du mois de novembre, début décembre, en ce qui a trait à l'information plus détaillée sur chaque communauté pour que les gens puissent savoir exactement l'état des choses dans chaque communauté. La réalité est telle qu'en 2015, on est entré au pouvoir avec comme constat un sous-investissement massif dans les communautés autochtones par les gouvernements précédents. C'est la réalité de la chose. 105 avis d'ébullition d'eau avec 0 plan pour les lever. Là, il y a un plan. On frise le 102e, on a levé le 101e aujourd'hui. Et il y a des plans dans chaque autre communauté pour les lever, en partenariat et en respect les priorités des communautés. Alors, l'effort qui a été dégagé sur le site Web, c'est de montrer aux Canadiens, aux Premières Nations, aux peuples autochtones, quel est cet engagement, quel est le plan de match pour surtout les communautés qui sont un peu plus complexes, où il y a des engagements plus à long terme avant qu'ils prennent la décision très difficile de lever leur avis d'ébullition. Et c'est ce que réclament notamment les 2 communautés auxquelles j'ai parlé. Ils sont très contents. C'est l'occasion de souligner le 100e, le 101e levé d'avis d'ébullition, mais aussi sont interpellés par le fait qu'au Canada, encore, c'est la réalité de la chose, que nous avons des avis d'ébullition à long terme qui perdurent. Mais là, ils vont pouvoir voir qu'il y a un plan de match et un plan de match pour lever chaque avis qui persiste dans les communautés.
Si je peux poursuivre pour la question, justement, parlant de chiffres, la question a été vraiment posée plusieurs fois par ma collègue de la presse canadienne, puis c'est effectivement pas clair, là. à chaque fois qu'on parle des avis, et y compris dans le rapport de la vérificatrice, puis aujourd'hui, on semble ne parler que des réseaux publics. Donc, on exclut toutes les communautés qui ont des problèmes d'eau potable, mais qui ne sont pas reliés à un réseau public. Puis là, le problème que je vois, c'est comme si on parlait de 100, mais au final, il y en a quoi? Il y en a-tu 1000 de plus? Puis je prends le Québec, on se dit zéro, mais Kitsiganzibi, Kitsakik ont encore ce problème-là. Est-ce que vous voyez ça juste comme ben c'est pas notre problème, c'est pas dans le réseau public?
Ben, la définition d'un réseau public, c'est un réseau qui est servi par je pense, plus de 5 puits ou 5 points de service. Donc, la définition est claire. Là, vous me posez une question sur l'eau en général, qui est tout aussi interpellant, évidemment. On parle de planification en infrastructure des communautés. On parle de nuances qui d'ailleurs, sont très importantes et je n'essaie pas de le nuire. Mais là, on parle aussi aujourd'hui d'un projet de lever des avis d'ébullition à long terme dans les communautés autochtones, qui est principalement la responsabilité du gouvernement du Canada. Chaque communauté, et puis on encourage chaque communauté d'avoir un plan d'infrastructure à long terme, et ce sont des choses avec lesquelles on va travailler. On a eu beaucoup de questions sur les puits individuels qui parfois peuvent être très éloignés d'une source ou d'un système en eau potable, de distribution en eau potable, qui serait la responsabilité du gouvernement du Canada. Là, c'est une discussion de planification avec la communauté en tant que telle. Parfois, c'est la responsabilité des provinces aussi, mais il faut s'en parler. Et ça, c'est une question plus générale, reliée à l'eau, mais une planification générale d'infrastructure avec laquelle on doit composer communauté par communauté selon leur projet d'infrastructure.
Merci. On va maintenant prendre une question de la salle. Next question.
Good afternoon, Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News. Can you help me understand how launching a new website helps communities get clean water faster?
Yeah, you could take two approaches to it. First and foremost, Canadians rightfully have been asking the federal government to do something that, with respect to a situation that shouldn't have been the case in the first place, which is clean water in Indigenous communities. And we made that commitment, and we're going to fulfill it. So Canadians are demanding answers, and this is something you requested in November and December, and we felt that Canadians, Indigenous peoples, need to see what we're seeing and what that commitment is, because there's been some questions about that commitment. So now that website gives more detail in a user-friendly fashion, where people can go community by community and say, what is the commitment of the federal government, and what is happening? What is the progress for each timeline to get the water advisory lifted? There sometimes is a knee-jerk reaction to say that this is a simple thing. It is very complex at times. It's something that has to be done in respect of the community's needs and priorities, but also knowing that there can be challenges. I've named COVID many times, but there are others. You can't deny that. The reality of it is that this government has made massive investments into infrastructure, and people want to see where that's going. And they want to see that commitment, particularly Indigenous communities that are still on long-term water advisories, for the long term. There is that barrier of trust that I've spoken often about that needs to be reinforced. So that effort of openness and transparency provides First Nations the certainty not only that it is happening in their community, but that it's happening, and Anikotin and Washishonagam spoke about it, but in other communities across Canada, because they don't think it's fair either, even though theirs are getting lifted and they've worked really hard to do it. So you may say that a website alone doesn't do that, but it does start to build the confidence, because people get to see what I'm seeing, what my department's seeing. They also get to see perhaps some of the challenges and pitfalls. And I think that's what we undertook as a government. They also need to see the commitment, and this is something that I will be doing in terms of speaking to community leadership with water advisory still in place. They'll get a letter that reinforces our commitment and the long-term commitment of the Government of Canada to them, because that is always an open question and it needs to be addressed for people to have that confidence. And in terms of our work with the community, they need to know that we're relentless in getting it done. And so that's what it provides.
What, if anything, is changing with your approach to doing this work in terms of policy changes? Because the Auditor General was very critical of this, saying that your department's working with a 30-year-old policy. So I'm wondering if you can give us more specifics. And do you have a timeline for when the majority of these advisories will be lifted by?
Yeah, and look, one of the big, while it may not strictly speaking, if you were to take a very strict capital infrastructure approach to this, connected to the lifting of a water advisory, communities have told us time again, and it's reflected in the risk ratings of critical infrastructure in communities, the need to have a long-term commitment in operations and maintenance, equal pay for equal work, and the policy was outdated. It was only an 80-20 model where sometimes the communities didn't have that extra 20. Some did, but some thought it was unfair. It is unfair. It should be fully funded, and that's what our commitment and our move in the fall to get that announced and out the door, which we're moving quite quickly to get out the door, to do achieves. It's important for communities to know that we are there with them. We are committed to doing it with them, and to be doing it in partnership. If I've learned anything in the short time I've been the minister, is we need to keep that dialogue open, and we need to keep our messaging with communities clear. And it's often at times where I've been a little careful speaking publicly about communities without their permission, because it is something some communities prefer to be more public and some don't, and there are examples of that, and that's something that we need to respect as well. It's one of the subtleties that we have to compose with when actually launching the website and the detail that we put in those updates. But it's something that we know contributes to building the trust, which shows communities that we'll be with them in the long term, and we're relentless in helping them get their long-term water advisories lifted. Oh, for the majority,
to have their advisories lifted.
Again, as I said to Jamie, the numbers I'm looking at, we are pretty confident that we can get that construction season back with the additional investments to communities, and then be down really to the short strokes. So I think this is something that perhaps we should discuss in the fall to see that progress. I'd look at Wave 2, which has hit Indigenous communities in terms of numbers 50 plus times harder than Wave 1. And there have been slowdowns that we need to respect, whether it's the example I gave for White Dog Wabsamung, or other communities that we had been hopeful in March would be lifted, but are going to take a little time. That may be June, and we need to respect that because of, notably in that case, an outbreak in the community.
Thanks, Olivia. Next question.
Hi, Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press. I'm wondering if you have any regrets that the government set the deadline for March 2021 to have all of these long-term advisories lifted, and if that's one of the reasons you're reluctant to put a more specific timeline on when the rest will be.
I don't think anyone cares about my regrets. Honestly, I'm not in a position to reflect on that. I know the job that I was told to get done, and I plan to get it done. This is something that is a basic matter of human decency, that in a country like Canada, people don't have access to clean water. It bugs me. But what's, again, whether it bugs me or not, probably most people don't care. What they want me here to do is to get it done. They want my deputy minister, who's leading a team that has been spending 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to keep people safe, focused on an equally important element in making sure people have clean water. So that's my responsibility. It's mine to own, and it's mine to get done with a team that has shown that it can change its ways through COVID. That has a large component of Indigenous voices within it that are showing us how we need to change things. And indeed, this is an old department. It may be new legally, but it has a long history to it, a long painful history to it. But it is committed to getting it done. I have spoken to chiefs. I've heard their feedback on some of the things they didn't think we did do as well. But that commitment, I believe, in the fall really is a signal to showing people that we're there for the long term. I don't want to undermine at the same time the two significant lifts that occurred today. And communities are very happy. I wish everyone could share in that, but they know that there's a lot more work to do, and they know that they have brother and sister communities across the country that aren't in their situation, and they're eager to keep the pressure on us to get it done. So, sort of my answer. Thanks.
In the fall economic statement, there was money, I think, for 5 years for new water treatment plants on reserves. And I'm wondering if that's any indication that you're concerned that there will be still this happening 5 years from now.
No, I mean, what the fall economic statement signals is continued investments on reserves. We've worked with communities for short-term, medium, and long-term investments. In some communities, while we could lift long-term water advisories, the Auditor General highlighted it, there were more longer-term investments to be made. So our signal to communities is that we're not, we're going to be with you past March 2021, whether it's your water infrastructure needs or others. This was one of the linked challenges in and around, I believe, Grassy Narrows, as we were announcing their water treatment, the Mercury Treatment Center. Some of those water and wastewater projects are reaching their end life, and that that's the case in a number of communities. So it isn't a signal that this would push a community towards a certain date, but just a signal that we're ready to invest with communities in the long term for their priorities, because those have been signaled through our conversations that they need longer solutions as communities grow.
Thanks so much. We'll now go back to the phone. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Brett Forrester, APTN News. Line open.
Hello, Minister. You've mentioned several times the promise of a long-term commitment, and so far I think I've heard two promises, a commitment to continued O&M funding as well as a commitment to co-develop a new regulatory regime. Are those the two main things, and are there any other elements to that promise to be there long-term?
Yeah, Brett, as you know, the current regime or the law that's in place was and has been largely criticized by First Nations, and so was not acceptable to them. So that commitment to work with them in partnership is ongoing. The AFN is working with us as well as other rights holders and regional organizations to fix that. It is something that we want to see done in the right way. But anything co-developed, if it's done in a respectful way, does in fact take time. That isn't the same thing as saying that there is no regulatory or compliance regime currently in place. No one would know about short-term water advisories or long-term water advisories if we didn't have an incredible group of water operators, many of whom are Indigenous, working around the country, testing, retesting, and collecting data to ensure that people are getting safe drinking water. So there isn't a void, but certainly there isn't the current status quo isn't ideal. But recall the massive criticism around the law that was brought in by former Prime Minister Harper, and the lack of as a unilateral colonial measure without the lack of investment and resources into it. So you mentioned two elements. One, the long-term element of O&M, which is our commitment to ensuring the asset integrity of water systems. You mentioned the second around a regulatory regime, but I would also add the third in terms of continued capital infrastructure into broadening our understanding of safe access to water that doesn't necessarily fall within the strict confines of lifting long-term water advisories. And your colleague in the previous question highlighted a number of those plans, and that may include ultimately new plants, but it can be things that vary in their level of investments and commitment.
Brett, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thanks. Switching gears a little bit for my follow-up, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the target audience for this new website, and the number that jumps out to me is the fact that Ontario has about 4 times as many impacted communities than the second most impacted province. So I'm wondering if you can explain why Ontario still has so many of these advisories, and in particular, why so many of these advisories are in the south or close to urban areas or municipalities and places like that.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. If you look at the broad spectrum of water advisories, you're absolutely right. The large majority of them reside in Ontario. I don't think, if I offered an explanation as to why that was for such a long time period, people would find it particularly compelling or credible. We've engaged with communities, I would say, and I would invite you to go through that renewed website as to what the particular status is in those communities with respect to the plan to lift those long-term water advisories. There are a number, and I would note a number of them that have had very, very long water advisories in place that are producing clean water. So I'm always hopeful. It is a matter of time. This is tested and clean water. That isn't the case in particular to one that captured everyone's attention and with good reason at the end of November and December in the Scandiga. The water now has been testing clean for some time. But that, by extension, does not mean that the community will necessarily lift the long-term water advisory. They've asked us for a number of other elements that I was glad to put into writing as to a pathway forward into lifting the water advisories. There is what I consider legitimate skepticism around water safety, given the history that if you've had 25 years, quarter of a century on a long-term water advisory, you can't expect people to have that confidence overnight. And the chief has highlighted that, and we've acknowledged it, and something we will work with them long-term. And yes, when you talk about stuff in the south, there is one community that, or perhaps a couple, that are stuck between 2 Great Lakes. So you ask yourself, why is that? But they're ready to lift theirs as well. So there is progress there. I would invite you to go through that site and look at the plans that are in place to lift them, because we're eager, and I'm eager to engage and continue to engage with leadership on the ground to renew our commitment to getting it done.
Thanks, Brett. And operator, last question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Next question is from Zach Becerra from Saskatoon Star Phoenix. Your line is open.
Hello, Minister, and a very early happy birthday. It happens that we share one, and I'm hoping that factoid will allow you to forgive me for changing course on questions here a little bit. You spoke earlier in the press conference about the threat of fraudulent vaccine deals, essentially. So I'll get right to it. Do you believe that James Smith Cree Nation and the FSIN asked Indigenous Services Canada for money to finance a vaccine deal that was not legitimate? And if not, what exactly happened there?
Look, Zach, these are difficult conversations we had, because when I reflect on the vaccine hesitancy that we've all talked about in Indigenous communities, my biggest worry, and I do worry about illegitimate offers, and we have indications from the companies that these offers are indeed not legitimate. That sets off a lot of alarm bells. I do worry about fraud. We should all worry about fraud. My greatest worry would be to see the chain of custody in these vaccines compromised. I know the logistics and the incredible operations that Canada has deployed to make sure that safe, effective, and free vaccines get into this country in a safe way. If that supply chain is compromised, money isn't my worry. My worry is the health and safety of the people that would get that vaccine. So those are the considerations we take into this when we see these offers that may be very, very attractive and may indeed seem too good to be true. I would venture to think that if they were legitimate, the government of Canada would be all over them and procuring them and offering them for free. I don't preclude any particular person or nation from doing what it can to make sure its people are safe. But from the perspective I have, the duty that I have, the duty that this department has towards Indigenous peoples, the integrity and safety of the chain of custody of a vaccine that if it were to get into a community and not be what it is supposed to be, could be devastating.
I spoke to Chief Wally Burns last week, and he alluded to a entity in Ontario that he said helped facilitate that proposed deal. That entity has denied any involvement in anything to do with COVID-19 vaccine procurement. But I'm wondering if ISC has taken any kind of corrective action here. Have you been in correspondence with law enforcement, for example? Is anything happening in response to this incident?
Yes, we've been in contact with law enforcement, and I would make it there. I would take this opportunity to make it as clear to anyone that's listening that anyone purporting to be an agent of the Indigenous Services Canada, that is a private company and not someone that is a member of the public service, should be looked on with great skepticism and indeed great reticence.
Thank you, Zach. And that concludes today's press conference. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.